Hello, and welcome to the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast. This is John Goodwin, your host. This podcast is dedicated to the aspiring writer and artist and will provide inspiration and tips from top professionals in the field. If you've been listening to this podcast or are new to it, I thank you very much. I would also appreciate if you took a moment and followed it on whatever platform you use to listen to your podcasts. David Farland began writing during college and entered short stories into various contests. But his career began in 1987 when he won the top award in the Writers of the Future contest. He published several science fiction and fantasy novels, including On My Way to Paradise, Star Wars, The Courtship of Princess Leia, and several best-selling fantasy series, including one of my personal favorites, The Rune Lords, and Of Mice and Magic. He has been nominated for the Nebula Award and the Hugo Award. He became a contest judge in 1991 and served as an instructor at the annual Writers' Workshop for several years. David Farland is currently the coordinating judge and editor for the Writers of the Future contest. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so I'm very much looking forward to this particular episode of the Writers of the Future podcast, because we're going to talk about specifically writing instructors and what works and what doesn't work. But before we get into that, your history with Writers of the Future, because you're the grand prize winner all the way back in volume 3. So I'm just curious how you found out about the contest and your curve to actually winning it.
Yeah, well, I joined a little writing group at Brigham Young University when I was there, and it was all science fiction and fantasy writers. And I probably had been going for a month or so when one of the authors, M. Shane Bell, said, "Hey, I've heard about this really cool new writing contest." Volume 1 of Writers of the Future had just come out. And so we all sat around and looked at it and decided we ought to enter. And so we entered stories. M. Shane Bell ended up winning a first place. I ended up winning, I think, a finalist the first time that I entered. And then I decided I'd better get serious if I was going to beat Shane. And so I entered my next story was On My Way to Paradise. And that's the one that won the grand prize. And within about 2 weeks of winning the grand prize, I ended up getting my first 3-book contract from Bantam Books.
Which is great. That was really, really great. So what makes Writers of the Future such an important aspect to the future of science fiction and fantasy?
Well, there's a lot of things going on with Writers of the Future that make it different. For one thing, one of the goals of the contest has always been to offer enough prize money to help make a difference in a writer's life. And so when I won my grand prize, of course, first thing I did was go out and buy a new computer so that I could write on it. And I also continued my writing education by buying books. And I stayed in college, of course. I was a senior in college at the time. And so there were a lot of benefits, but then there's also the publication that you get, the recognition that you get from publishers and from editors and literary agents. All of that factors into what makes this such a valuable contest, because, you can win a small regional contest and it's not going to make a whole lot of difference. But if you win something big like this, everybody finds out about it.
Yeah. Plus, this contest is now grown so much that it's got entries from over 175 countries. And it's, we have winners every year from all over the world, which is just really, really great. And you get to see all the entries, and it's considerably more than it was in 1985 when the first call went out.
Yes, exactly.
Now, the contest was created by L. Ron Hubbard shortly following his having released Battlefield Earth. So how familiar were you with him at the time, or how familiar did you become with him as a result of the contest?
I wasn't real familiar with L. Ron Hubbard at the time. I remember that my parents had a Dianetics book, as I recall, growing up, and so I was familiar with the name. But he hadn't been writing science fiction and whatnot for a few years, and I was I was paying a lot of attention to who was winning awards at the time. I was looking at the Hugos and the Nebulas and stuff like that. And I was working back historically, reading a lot of novels back into the 1950s and that kind of thing. But I wasn't super familiar with them at the time.
Got it. And so then once you found out about the contest and the fact that he had been one of the most popular writers of pulp fiction, anything about that once you started reading him that impressed you about his writing?
Well, one of the things that I looked at was just how do I say this? How businesslike he was. He knew how to grab an audience. It was obvious that he was crafting stories. His talk about how do you build a story and build it quickly and get it to publication, that was the kind of advice that came from somebody who was doing it every day, not from a literary professor who'd never actually written a story. And that just made an awful lot of sense. I think that coming in it from academia, you tend to have a little bit of a jaundiced view of what publishing is really like. And so, to see that, gosh, not only can you make a living as an author, but you can make a really good living. You can become internationally famous and that kind of thing. That was one of the first lessons that I think I took from that.
I get it. And in the workshop, and also on the online writing workshop, which you are one of the 3 instructors that teaches, there's about 10 of his essays that are used in the winner's workshop that we use also in this. What about his essays? You mentioned one a little bit about the business of writing, but any particular essays that for you really made a difference in your own craft?
I think all of them did, to be honest, because I read them, I studied them. And then, of course, in teaching the workshop in later years, I got to reread them and think about them. And it's funny because I think the first year that I took the workshop, I'm not sure that a lot of it stuck. I think there was an awful lot of stress and tension and, gosh, am I going to win the award? And you're paying attention to a lot of other things. But as I got down and started focusing on it, I just kind of found that each one of them was a gem. There was more information in there than I remembered. So it was just packed full of it.
Which is great. Yeah, and what we're even doing this year is all the winners, before they come out, we're asking to do the free online writing workshop that you, Tim, and Scott Card created, so they can get a bit of a leg up, so you can get a little more detail into what you talked about in those videos and what Ellen Hubbard talked about in those essays, and take it even deeper than what they normally are able to get in that 1-week crash course that they come out for.
Love it. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. So on the fact of a writing instructor, which is one thing that you're quite well known for. So basically give me a run through of like, what do you do? What should somebody be looking for? What should they stay clear of in writing instructors?
Well, I've been teaching now for about 30 years, and I teach in a lot of different ways. I taught creative writing at Brigham Young University, and some of my students did quite well from there. I was a writing instructor for Brandon Sanderson, who's huge right now, and for Stephenie Meyer, who did Twilight, and for Dan Wells and a number of other authors, all who've gone on to become extremely successful. And then I've also worked with a lot of people in private little writing workshops. So I'm always teaching writing workshops. I actually have a little bit of a problem with catching a lot of illnesses pretty easily. I've got an immune system that doesn't work really well, so I don't like going into public places a lot. And so teaching online helps me a lot. And then, when I go to conventions, I very often will teach at conventions. And so there's a lot of different ways a teacher can instruct, I guess, when you're teaching writing nowadays that maybe weren't open to us 20, 30 years ago. But I think that there's just so many different ways that you can approach it. I think that, if I were to to start looking at what a writing teacher is and what do you want from a writing teacher, one of the first things that I look at is I would look at the writing teacher's background. There are a lot of writing teachers who are coming from academia, and maybe they're really good at deconstructing a story, but it's sort of like deconstructing a frog. You can deconstruct a frog with a scalpel, but when you're done, you don't have a frog anymore. You've got some dead meat on the table. And when you're trying to create a story, it's like you're coming at it different. You're exercising different mental muscles and things like that. And so I really think that a writing instructor ought to be somebody who writes. And ideally, I would be looking for somebody who writes really well. For example, some writing instructors are Nobel Prize winners, and yet they could be terrible writing teachers. For example, Ernest Hemingway used to kind of make fun of his authors. If they would ask a question that he considered to be stupid, he'd give them stupid answers, and he'd mislead them. So, for example, somebody once asked him, what kind of chair do you write in? And he said, I don't write in a chair, I stand. And a lot of writers began standing when they wrote, thinking that maybe that would pump more blood to their brain. And the fact is that he did write in a chair. Okay. He just didn't want to admit it. And he couldn't have told you what kind it was anyway. But he would do things like that. He once told an audience that, gosh, you should revise everything that you write at least 60 times. And then someone asked him, how long should we wait between revisions so that we can look at it with a cold eye? And he said 2 years. So, folks, if you want to use his techniques, 120 years from now, you can submit your first short story. Obviously, he didn't do that. He was a pretty bad writing teacher, but he was a fantastic writer and a Nobel Prize winner. And other times, I've seen writing teachers who maybe aren't great writing teachers, but they're great teachers. Okay. And they can teach just about anything. And so I would look for a writing teacher who actually writes. First of all, I would look for someone who's an accomplished teacher who can communicate. I think of it as being sort of like a radio tower that's sending out radio signals. And you, as the teacher, are trying to send out clear signals to the authors who are trying to learn the topic. And they're the little radar dishes out there, tuning in as best they can, trying to get clear data. And I'm trying to figure out how to get that to you as well as I can, so that you can act upon it. That's all it comes down to. So I look at it from the point of view of, okay, I want to be a good, clear writing teacher. Beyond that, there are so many things that go into it. I think being positive and upbeat with authors. I've seen authors that their first stories didn't look like much. In fact, I remember looking at one author years ago and thinking, oh, this poor guy's never going to get anywhere. He's now the best-selling writer in the science fiction field. Okay. So sometimes your first efforts don't really show how well you can do in the long run. As I've mentioned, I've taught Stephenie Meyer and Brandon Sanderson and people like that, and their efforts weren't always stellar in the beginning. You couldn't look at them. I remember Stephenie Meyer looking at her story and thinking, this girl has a fantastic ability to create different voices for stories. And I thought, if she ever gets really serious about one, she's going to be dangerous. She could go a long way. And sure enough, with Twilight, she was able to capture the voice of a character so well that it just sucked in, over 250 million sales at this point. So, there's an awful lot that goes in here, recognizing that not everybody has the same strengths. One author can be really great at plotting a story. Another one can have a gift for creating in-depth characters. A third one might be a fantastic stylist. Most writing teachers, if they see someone who's a stylist, they think he's a great writer. That's not necessarily true. You can be a great stylist and create really boring stories, and that happens all the time. So I'm always looking for authors that have strengths, and then find out what those strengths are, and say, okay, now what are we going to add to that? What new strengths can we develop for you?
Right.
And that's the way that we want to take it.
I get it. So now when you're working with someone, do you do better when you're working one-on-one, or is it better when you've got a whole group that you can work with, and then they're just everybody's moving forward and then feeding off of each other's responses too?
I think that I think there's different learning styles, and I think that in different situations, each method can be the best. I've been in a lot of classes where I've seen people feeding off of one another, mirroring one another's successes, and I think that's really great. But there are those times where an author just needs the one-on-one, and part of it, I think, is that an awful lot of people need to know that a teacher cares enough about them to give them the one-on-one, that it sort of validates all of the hard work that they're putting into it.
Right. I remember when I went to BYU and I was a guest speaker at Brandon Sanderson's class, teaching creative writing, which was, I guess he followed you teaching that, that class. And I mean, it was a pretty full class. He had like 100, 150 students there. And they were all very interested in the writers of the future, because he had acknowledged the fact that he had been a finalist and what it had done for him. But that's a very specific environment. They're teaching at a university class. Do you find it's best, like if you're able to teach somebody, like right now we're in the world of Zoom workshops and stuff, but then did it go easier when you actually had a in-person class? I think you're going to be going to that workshop in Las Vegas in a couple of months. What is that? The 2020?
20 books to 50K. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like there's advantages to both. When you're in a group, it does feel more intimate. It gives people a chance to, gosh, I'm taking lunch. We can talk at lunch or something like that, one-on-one. And I really like that. On the other hand, with my Zoom classes, I'll teach a class and I'll have someone in India and another person in New Zealand and another person in China. And so I could reach people all over the world. And so I tend to really like that format. That works pretty well for me in getting a large group. And I'm kind of like Brandon. When I taught my last class, I was going to open it up for 30 people, and we had 170 before I could even get the darn thing closed. So I ended up having to teach 3 classes. I wanted to break it down into smaller groups, but yeah, the point is that it makes it a lot easier for students, because they don't have to take time away from work. They don't have to drive hundreds of miles. They don't have to spend money on hotels and things like that. So I'm really liking and this format. In fact, I asked some of my students recently. I said I want to start a new writing class. I was going to put up a class for my epic novel writing workshop. And I said, I'm going to do one. I'm trying to decide if I should do it in Salt Lake or Las Vegas, or, where I should do this next one. And every single person said, do it online. I don't want to have to travel that far. And so people have gotten really used to this new format, and it's taking over, I think.
And they can still get, I guess, a lot of individualized attention as well. Do you do breakout sessions to get with people individually, or how does that work?
What I do is I do question and answer sessions with them, and I take a little extra time. I'll teach the class, and then I'll stay for an extra 20 minutes or so to answer individual questions. But a lot of people just send me questions via email. And then, of course, when they turn in their assignments, I can look at their assignments and give them comments and that kind of thing. So they're getting really the same kind of individual attention that you would get in a class. With Stephenie Meyer, she came and asked one day after school, okay, how do I write the best-selling young adult novel of all time? And so I said, okay, let's go to my office. And we just sat down for the next hour and a half and plotted out what became Twilight. But that was a process where you go, okay, this is not something that we could normally handle in class. And so for that, I have the option where students can, they can say, I want a private consultation. And so they don't even have to be a student in a class. Anybody can do that. But I do private consultations, and I did 2 of those today, helping people with various novels and trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to take this from idea to print, and go from there.
Wow. So that brings up a point now. Some of these how-to questions. One thing that you mentioned, because you said various things that you go over when you do your teaching, is I have not really addressed this particularly in this podcast before, but how do you analyze an audience? So there's all kinds of audiences out there, and the idea of like, I'm going to write something that's going to just bowl over everybody. That ain't going to happen, So what's the actual technology of how to analyze an audience, and what is being just ridiculous thinking you're going to get this versus what's realistic to shoot for?
Well, audiences read stories because there are positive emotions that they're looking for in their lives. And those positive emotions are pretty well documented. In Hollywood, I worked as what's called a greenlighting analyst. I would look at screenplays, and I would look at the screenplay and see what emotions the screenplay aroused. And then I would look at who the intended audience was, how old the stars were going to be playing in each role, that kind of thing. And then we could figure out a formula that allowed us to compare it to similar movies, so that we could figure out exactly how many people were going to come to that movie in the first 2 opening weeks. Once we knew that information, we could figure out how much it was going to cost to make the movie, and then decide whether or not to give the movie the green light, whether we should go ahead and make it. And so it's a mathematical formula. And most people are scared of mathematical formulas. It's not particularly hard to do, but that's what I did in Hollywood. And the same mathematical formula works here in books. New York doesn't hire an analyst like me to go out and look at books, but maybe they should. I was asked to help choose a book to push big back in 1998 for Scholastic, and I chose Harry Potter, and we pushed it big. And they asked, how do we go ahead and promote this book so that it goes big? And we turned it into the best-selling novel of all time. And so that book, it cost millions of dollars to promote, but it made billions of dollars in return. And so we can look at books and make some pretty good educated guesses about how they're going to do. But the emotions that are important to arouse are, number 1, wonder. This is for young adult readers and for children in particular. Next, we have humor. That's for everybody. Everybody loves humor to a certain degree. So it has a very high audience rating. Horror is big. There needs to be some horror element in every movie. I don't care if it's a sweet romance, you still have to have the horror of what it would be like to live alone without love. It has to be raised as a specter for the readership. But then we get into things like adventure, fighting action scenes, people going off into the unknown. That's a huge beat. Then we have romance, which is what Stephenie Meyer and I worked with on Twilight. I said, if you want to write the best-selling young adult novel of all time, it's going to combine romance with wonder and then we throw in enough adventure so that you could get some male audience to it too. But in any case, we've got that as a huge one, particularly for older women. Once they hit their mid-teens on up, okay, until their 40s, and then it starts dying down a bit when a woman gets into her 40s. Then the next ones that we have are drama, mystery. Both of those are huge emotional beats. So those are the 8 emotional beats. And if you notice, when I talk about those aren't just emotional beats in movies, but they're also genres for books. Okay, wonder is science fiction and fantasy. Humor, horror, those are just straight. Romance, mystery, all of those elements, each of them is a particular genre of books. So they're pretty easy to quantify. There are some emotions that are positive emotions that we don't measure. For example, nostalgia. If you see a movie that really arouses a strong sense of nostalgia, you may absolutely love it. But in Hollywood, we didn't sit down and analyze such movies and say, aha, this will capture the 90-year-old audience really well.
Well, On Golden Pond did pretty good.
Yes, On Golden Pond, but I think that's a rare example. There's only a few of them. You can take something like The Christmas Story, about the little kid who wants to buy the Red Ryder BB gun. That was pure nostalgia, very funny, had a great audience response, but we don't get many movies like that.
For sure. All right, so that's obviously important. So at what point does a person, I guess I'm developing the question as I'm talking to you now, because I'm going to write a story. I want to write a story about red BB guns and a Palomino. And so you got this whole thing figured out, but then say, what's the audience? Working backwards from that to get the audience. What's the correct sequence to actually put together a story? Do you work out the audience first? Do you work out a story idea? How do you build, like you starting off and like, I'm going to write a book?
Okay. If I were going to write a book and I wanted to start out, I'd look at the audience first. Is there an audience for this? How big is the audience? Can I make it bigger by doing certain things? You're looking at the idea of, okay, I want to create a bestseller. A bestseller usually appeals to a wide audience, male, female, old, and young. They're called the 4 pillars in Hollywood. And when you are trying to appeal to that wide audience, you very often have to appeal to different emotions. You have to have a sense of wonder, and you've got to have some adventure, and there's got to be some humor and horror. And so it ends up being a bunch of different genres wrapped up together. And you'll get a movie like Star Wars that had all of that and had some drama too. Or you can get, The Mummy or something along that line. Those are movies that make great date movies. They appeal to anybody from the age of, 8 years old to 60 or something like that. And so I look at basically how wide of an audience appeal will this movie have, and or this book, and then judge from there.
I get it. Yeah, when I interviewed S.M. Sterling a couple months ago, and he said when his first novel came out, and it was bought, it was I think science fiction. The editor said, "Okay, make it romance." He said, "What? It's science fiction?" Yeah, I know, but romance has an audience 10 times the size of science fiction at that time. So he turned to romance and did quite well. So sometimes too, the audience was a determining factor of what was finally accepted by the publisher.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. If you, think about it this way. When you write a book, if you write a book and you aim it right at, say, 5 million people, that's the most sales that you're going to get. You can, though, go ahead and aim it and do a scattergun approach and try to aim it at a wider audience and say, instead of going for 5 million, I'm going to go for 50 million, and you're going to get a wider audience. One of the reasons why I recommended Harry Potter was that, gosh, it had a great appeal to young children. But one of the first things that I did was when I got the book and I was looking at it and some other books, is I gave it to my wife and said, okay, how's it going to appeal to an older woman? My wife loved it. Pretty soon she was fighting with my 10-year-old daughter to see who could read it next. And then I read it and saw that it appealed to both older men and would appeal to young boys. And I just said, okay, this one works really well for a wide audience. And there's a lot of different kinds of stories wrapped in there. Hagrid is raising dragons secretly in his room and falls in love with a giantess. And, so you've got mystery, you've got romance, you've got all sorts of things that are being added together to create a tapestry that basically every reader will enjoy. And that's why it was worth promoting as a big book.
Sure. Now, do you think, is that what J.K. Rowling was planning on? Or was she this was the story based on her nighttime telling a story to her kids that she then put into story format and wrote a book off of it?
I think personally that J.K. Rowling is what I would say is she's a natural genius at audience analysis. Okay. I don't know how much of it she consciously was aware of, but I think subconsciously she knew what she was doing. Okay.
Sure.
And you can find people who are like that, who are great at shooting baskets from the 60-foot range or something like that. And you can ask them, how do you do that? And they're like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I suspect it's probably a bit of that. And I also think she's probably a good student of writing and whatnot. She took her time to imagineer her stories, well in advance.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely enjoyed them a lot. And as Scott Card said too, he thought they were brilliant because it totally turned a bunch of young people into readers, which then became readers for his books too.
Absolutely.
People that love to read books aren't particular. I can only read this author. They're going to want to read other books that they like. So then on staying back on this analyzing an audience then, so if you got a person out who wants to make it as a writer, so, okay, I've got an idea. They've done maybe the online writing workshop that we've got with Writers of the Future. So they've got the first short story based upon those steps there. At what point does it become important that a person starts looking at analyzing an audience as compared to being able to even just write a story successfully in the first place?
Well, that's a good question because I don't know that there's any one way that you have to learn. I like the idea of analyzing the audience first, then writing the story. Okay. And by that, I mean plotting the story. So in my courses, I teach audience analysis, and then we go into plotting, and then we go into actually composing the story, scene by scene, paragraph by paragraph, line by line, so that we try to basically work from the big ideas down to the execution of the very smallest, dots and slashes on our T's and that kind of thing. So I'm very interested in teaching writers how to build worlds. Okay, how do you develop characters so that we have good dynamics between our heroes and our villains and our guide characters and our minions and these different types of characters, and then how do we build a plot out of that? There's so much that goes into developing societies, for example, and customs and belief systems. And then when you start putting into the form of story, how do you transport an audience? How do you capture their imagination? And so there's a whole science behind that, where we talk about appealing to the proper senses in the proper order so that the readers are basically carried away in their imagination. They actually sort of become hypnotized, because they're exercising parts of their brain that you may not be exercising in your daily work routine. And we end up going into what's referred to as the alpha state, which is a state of consciousness where you are kind of daydreaming, I guess is about the easy way to put it. But you're transported into the story and you're being told this is what you're going to see and hear and smell and those kinds of things, and it comes alive for you. And that's when a reader, can suddenly sort of find themselves turning into a character and taking this inner journey that feels as if they've lived through it. Anybody who's read Lord of the Rings may come back feeling as if they have traveled across Middle Earth and they've walked across the plains of Mordor and thrown the ring into the crack of doom and had Gollum bite their finger off and all of those kinds of things. We basically on a symbolic level end up taking that journey with the protagonist. And that's why stories can be so profoundly effective in teaching people and changing behavior and that kind of thing.
Now, when you won Writers of the Future 34 years ago now with On My Way to Paradise, were you thinking all this stuff then? Or is this, you've got like over 3 decades now of becoming like the guru of creative writing? Well, was that what's going on in your head when you started?
I think I've learned a lot since then. I
would like to think so.
I wrote an article back then called the let's see what was it called. I wrote an article on the stress induction / reduction technique of storytelling, and I gave a talk on that once, probably 3 or 4 years after I wrote the article. And Algis Budrys read it or heard me give the talk, and he says, that's probably the best talk on writing that's been given in 2,500 years. And I'm like, well, thank you. That was nice, because he was putting me in competition with Aristotle. But I've learned a lot since then because I've had 30 years to think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah. Now, on your writing, because you did a podcast earlier, this is probably about a year ago now, on the L. Ron Hubbard article called Manuscript Factory. And that's when Mr. Hubbard goes into just, the business of writing. And he analyzed, because he wrote in all the genres. He wrote mystery, he wrote Western, he wrote science fiction, fantasy, adventure, he wrote some romance. And he worked out his word rate and how much he made per story. And that's how he would analyze what to write, because he enjoyed writing everything. But he just broke it down. And then he got into, obviously, his creation was quite excellent, because he could just like get into that world and just be that. Yeah. But he had a lot of bullpen as well to be able to assist with that. And you talked about that was one of the most significant essays for you. How much does that tie into? Because you've written science fiction, you've written fantasy, you've written how-to books, the nonfiction books on creative writing and how to write.
Historical novels, young adult
novels, all these different things you've written here. How does that fit in for you on, like, do you write for, obviously you enjoy what you do, but do you write for pleasure? I really want to write a fantasy novel, or do you write based upon what the market will bear to be able to be the best for you?
I think I cheat in that I write what I want, I guess is about the easy way to put it. I get bored doing the same thing over and over. And so I don't think that I was ever meant to sit down and say, write 20 fantasy novels in a row. I might be able to write 3 in a row, but then I want to write something different and, kind of break it up and take a vacation and then come back to it. But for me, that article really was important, because when you're a writer and you're coming from academia, very often you're going to be sloppy. You're probably not going to hit your deadlines when it comes to writing. You've been told that a real artist takes his time. And if it takes you a week to craft a sentence, it was a week well spent, and all kinds of baloney like that. And the truth is that no, a writer's got to write and they've got to work. And one of the things that I like to tell writers is that when you're writing, you are an international business man. You are a company that produces manuscripts, and you are producing them for the global market. I have friends who have made millions of dollars. I got one friend who made millions of dollars in Romania. Okay. Little tiny market, but she hit number one on the bestseller list and stayed there for a long time. And you can do things like that in this market. When you write a book, you have to be aware that it might be translated into 25 or 30 different languages. And so you want to pay attention to the global audience and to your marketing opportunities for all of those audiences. And when I write a book nowadays, I look at it and I say, okay, I'm going to write this book. How am I going to turn it into an ebook? How am I going to turn it into an audio book? How am I going to get it printed in the United States? And how am I going to, who am I going to sell the rights to globally? All of these kinds of questions. And then, how are we going to turn this into video games and movies later on? So we're looking at really how to liquidate the rights on a global market. And I think that none of my professors in college ever thought on that level.
Right.
They were totally lost. If you were to sit in class on the first day and ask that question, so, professor, how do I liquidate my global rights for my first book here? Most of them would probably rightly just, gape at you and not know how to answer. Yeah. I know how to answer that, but I think it may be the wrong question for a beginning writer to ask.
Yeah, I think that's correct on that. So now you're talking about, you broadened out a little bit talking about, the 25 languages and stuff. So what about how to best deal with your intellectual property? Because you've got, again, looking at your own career, I've seen you've got your books, you got your translations, you got the audiobooks, but you're talking about earlier on spending stints in Hollywood, and I know you've done stuff with gaming. Mm-hmm. How does that tie in? Has this all been associated with your own books, or how those connect up?
No, I worked for a company years ago. I was writing the Rune Lords, and I wanted to create a video game based on the Rune Lords world that I was doing. And so I went to I read about a little video game company in town, and so I went and visited them and said, "Hey, I'm a writer. This is what I do." And I gave them a copy of the Rune Lords, and they asked me to go ahead and help work with them a little bit. And so they asked if I was any good at writing proposals, and I happen to be very good at writing proposals. So I wrote a proposal for a game called StarCraft Brood War, which ended up kind of going huge and becoming one of the best-selling video games of all time. It's still used in the final rounds of the World Championship of Video Game Players in Korea. And so I started designing video games there, and then went into scripting and things like that. So I worked a bit with video games. And then afterwards, I went into Hollywood just because I wanted to learn about writing in different mediums, not just in books and novels, but how are we going to do it in video games? How are we going to do it in film or in future as yet uncreated mediums?
Yeah, that's it's interesting you bring that up, because some people will notice that they're not able to get Writers of the Future ebooks prior to, I think, volume 20, because an ebook didn't exist then. And so now we don't have the rights to the stories to make them as ebooks from earlier on. So they're not going to exist as ebooks. Just as an aside on that.
Yeah. I mean, I hadn't thought about that. You should have grabbed up those rights, to produce them in any format yet to be invented. Yeah.
That was something that, it's just books are books, and that's what they are. And then audiobooks, so we had rights for audiobooks, but you had print. We were being clever, so you could do hardback, paperback, trade paperback, and all different formats of paperback, but we didn't have the ebook because that wasn't a conceived of thing yet.
Yeah. When we get into, brain machine interfaces and everybody's hooked up to the cloud, and I send you a book in a an ebook format. Is it really an ebook anymore? It's just a data file, ones and zeros. I don't even know how we're going to deal with that in the future.
Well, hopefully we do, because there's a lot of people's professions and livelihoods based upon copyright protection and being able to monetize their properties.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so getting back now to creative writing and teaching creative writing and instructing authors. So we've talked about what's good, but what should somebody watch out for? What should somebody kind of raise the jaundiced eye and say, whoa, 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 whoa?
Well, I think anytime that a teacher becomes too prescriptive and says, oh, you have to do it this way, there's a lot of different ways I like to say that there's 10,000 right ways to write any story. There's a million wrong ways, but there's still 10,000 right ones. So you can sit down and say, I'm going to write a story and I'm a pantser. I'm just going to start writing and see where it goes. I've had books that have sold that way. I've had students, one of my recent students wrote a book that, she sat down and she had no idea where it was going. Each week she would just go ahead and write out a new chapter. And she made the cover of Publishers Weekly 3 times last year, so that was Elizabeth Chatsworth, who's also a recent winner.
Really? So she's a pantser. You want to define that term so people listening to this will know what you're talking about?
A pantser is somebody who doesn't plot the novel in advance. They're just someone who sits down and starts a story and thinks, wouldn't it be cool if I had a character who was doing this, and just see where the story goes. And that can work really well for some people. Other people,
writing from the seat of their pants.
Yeah. The big problem is that they tend to get to a place where they get boxed in and they don't know how to take the novel forward. And so very often they'll give up. And so there's a lot of pantsers who write themselves into dead ends and then just kind of give up at writing. But, most people who are New York Times bestsellers are plotters, and they sit down and think about what the overall plot would be. And I've written books both ways. And I think generally speaking, I like to have a good idea of where the plot's going. I don't need to know every detail, but that's just one example of different ways to do things,
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard writing instructors. I remember one writing instructor years ago who said that all storytelling is audio, that people really hear the story in their heads. No, that was him. Okay. There are some people who hear the stories in their heads. There's other people who see the stories in their imagination. And there's other people who feel the stories emotionally. And so you need to figure out how to combine various techniques. So whenever I get somebody who's too dictatorial about how to write, I tend to want to be a little bit wary of them. And then, of course, whenever I find a teacher who doesn't write, who's never written, who doesn't understand how to publish a story, when you get done with writing a book and you want to figure out how to sell it to a major publisher or how to self-publish the book, there's a lot of information that goes into that. And I run a large writing workshop group with about 400 authors, and we bring in bestsellers in every genre and every way that you can possibly publish. And there's just a lot of ways to make a living in this business. But if somebody doesn't understand any way to make a living, then you've got problems.
Right. So now, in terms of a writing instructor and fees, what's something to you should watch out for as something as a bad indicator?
Well, I've seen writing instructors who will say, "Oh, I'm going to charge $8,000 for this class," and I think that's a bit pricey, And I tend to like to create classes where you get a lot of participation where you can ask questions, where you learn a lot, but you're not paying so much for them. I'm perfectly happy to give away information. In fact, I've been for 14 years, I've been running a blog where you can get free writing tips, from David Farland sent directly to your inbox.
Straight to their pants. A kick from
straight
David Farland to their pants.
It's called my David Farland Kick in the Pants originally.
Yep. Yeah.
Somebody asked one day, what I really need is for you to come give me a kick in the pants every day. And I thought, well, that's just kind of outrageous. You shouldn't dare ask for that. And I thought, actually, I could at least write a little article. And so I started doing that. But the point here is that, we give away some information, but if a person really gets serious, then they usually want to come and get some really concentrated information. And so I would give away writing tips, but then I'd also teach writing workshops. And I like to try to get something that makes enough money so that you can live on, while at the same time performing a good service for the author. And that's a little bit hard to talk about, because let's say that you're a person living in India or in, let's say, Jakarta or someplace. Gosh, your fees are probably going to be out of reach for most people. So you need to have at least something for everyone. But then there are people who say, gosh, Dave, I'd pay you to come to my house, and you can just teach me writing. I'll give you, $100,000. And I don't ever do that either. Mm-hmm. I don't want to be the person who's just teaching, the world's most, world's wealthiest wannabe writers. So I try to find something that's reasonable. I don't have any workshop or any class that has ever been more than $1,000. And in fact, I feel guilty for having a class that's that expensive. But my new epic novel writing workshop, for example, where you're learning how to write a book like Dune or like Lord of the Rings, that one's a pretty big, expensive, and very intensive workshop. I looked at it and I just said, yeah, for the amount of work that I've got to put into it, I'm going to have to charge something outrageous. Most of my classes are usually a lot less than that, usually about half that price.
Right. I get it.
My 318R class, I teach about 25 lessons in that class. So about 25 to probably 30 to 35 hours of class time. That one runs about $580 now. But that gives you a really good overview of the entire business of writing, not just how to write a book, how to plot it, how to create a world, but also how to sell it in film, how to sell it as an ebook or whatever you want. I like to try to take the information as wide as I can.
I get it. Now, that seems different than master classes.
It is. The master classes don't give you a real overview of the entire field the way that I do. Okay. Master classes are fun. Okay. They're a blast. But if you took a master class on writing, you may only get a couple of hours of information, and the information is kind of exciting and mind-blowing and things like that. But you typically don't get an overview of how this entire field works and how you're going to make a living as a writer in it. And what I'm trying to do is to create writers who understand how to make a living in it.
I get it. That makes sense on that. Yeah, with one thing that we do have is, and I'll plug it again here too, because you're part of it, is the L. Ron Hubbard Writers of the Future online workshop, which has been very successful. We've got like 5,000 students taking the course. We've had 600 people have downloaded the certificates, closer to 1,000 people that have said that they're done with it. But it's been a real successful program for us, getting out a lot of education on the subject of writing, creative writing, and these essays that you use in the workshop have been very successful. Then obviously listening to you, Tim Powers, and Orson Scott Card with your various expertises on, I think, 13 different videos, which has just been a really successful program for us.
Yeah, I had a student who looked at it the other day and said, gosh, there's more information packed in that than a hundred workshops that I've been to, and she was just going on and on about how much she had learned from it, even though this is a person who's on the verge of becoming a professional author. She had. She just said, yeah, there's just a tremendous amount of information there. And I think that there is,
Yeah.
anytime that you are trying to teach writing, there's so much that you can get. And like with my 318R class that I teach, Brandon Sanderson took it twice. Dan Wells took it twice. They'd take it the first time, and then they'd say, "Okay, there's just too much coming in here. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose, and I better go back and listen again." And that's basically what I want. I want people to feel like that. So when I teach my classes, one of the things I do is I record all the calls, so you can go back and listen to them, or if you miss one, you can go back and listen to it in your free time. And there's an astonishing number of people that are downloading these things and listening to them every day.
Wow, that's really good. Well, this has been great talking to you. So now, in terms of how people can find these different workshops that you're talking about here, where do they go to find them?
Okay. Well, if you want to learn about writing and you want to go to one of my workshops, you can go to www.mystorydoctor.com. And there you can sign up for my free newsletter and get free information. I've got a free book that I give out where I took 100 of my favorite writing tips, 400-page book, and said, okay, just go ahead and have that. And then what I've done is we also have my writing classes. Now, I mentioned some writing classes like the 318R. My fall is really filled up. When I put a writing class up now, my last writing class pretty much filled up in about 2 hours, and I still let in twice as many people as I promised myself I would. So when I do open up a writing class, they tend to fill up really quickly. But I've made it so that you can put your name down on a email list, so that I will tell you when the next one opens before I tell anybody else, so that you can get in. And that's pretty much the way that I do it for my big writing group, which. What I do with my writing group, I have a number of classes workshops that I've recorded. And so you get access to all of my recordings for my workshops, which are pretty in-depth. And when you join the Apex Writers Group, you get access to those. But we also bring on guests and do video calls with people like Orson Scott Card and Terry Brooks, and with editors and major movie producers and things like that.
Is that the one that I was on? Is that the one I was a guest?
Mm-hmm. And so I bring in experts from different fields of writing and editing and filmmaking, and so that you can learn from them. And then beyond that, we have one person. We have Forrest Wolverton, my son, who basically helps people get excited about writing and stay motivated. So we've got a motivational expert on our staff. And then we take it even farther than that. There's all sorts of little subgroups that you can join. So if you want to write fantasy, you could join a group of other fantasy writers, and they get together and they do daily sprints. Where they sit down at the computer at the same time, and they just say, let's go write for 6 hours. And maybe they'll just sit there and write for 6 hours. And I've had people that are writing books like mad by using this method. Other ones have groups where you can sit down and plot a novel, figure out how to bang one out. Others have groups where you critique the writing that you've done, and this kind of thing. We have writers' rings where you have writers working in the same genre, trying to build for the same audience. We're getting ready to start a writer's strategy group where you can figure out a strategy for how to get published, how to make a living, how to win awards, those kinds of things. So my goal here is to basically say, move away from the teaching writing workshops all the time, and instead kind of adopt this holistic approach to, okay, let's help you get everything that you can. And the price for that is $230 a year, which ends up being a lot less than the cost of taking a writing workshop or something like that. So you can get the same kind of information, the same quality, but spend a lot less money.
Well, that's great. And it's all at mystorydoctor.com.
And that's at mystorydoctor.com. Apex Writers Group is at www.apex-writers.com.
Great. Well, this has been great, Dave. I very much appreciate being able to chat with you on this.
Okay.
And thank you for listening. Subscribe to the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. We've also been syndicated on the United Public Radio Network, where you can find these podcasts as well by just typing in Writers of the Future. Again, thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.